Under the hills south of Bath, beneath gardens, driveways, and a golf course nobody thinks twice about, there is a mile of absolute darkness bored straight through solid rock. No windows, no shafts to the surface, no way for air, light, or smoke to escape once you are inside it. It was dug by hand in the 1870s to move stone and coal, and it very nearly finished off the company that built it before a single train ran through. It has no ventilation at all, which doesn't sound like much of a problem until you learn that men have died in this tunnel, suffocated by their own train's smoke in the pitch black, half a mile from either end. And yet today, that same mile of solid, sealed darkness is lit, resurfaced, and walked through by thousands of ordinary people every single week, on purpose, for fun. A tunnel with a body count is now one of the most quietly beloved leisure routes in the south of England. This is the story of how that happened, and why it very nearly didn't. This is the story of the Combe Down Tunnel, a railway built to bankrupt itself. The Somerset and Dorset Railway was never supposed to be an easy company to run. It connected the Bristol Channel to the English Channel, hauling coal and freight across the West Country on a line that was underfunded from the start. By the early 1870s, the railway's ambitions had outgrown its balance sheet. What it wanted was Bath, a direct extension into the city, would connect the line to the Midland Railway and open up traffic that could finally make the whole enterprise profitable. What it needed to get there was 1 mile of solid oolitic limestone, standing directly in the way, 300 feet beneath the hill known as Combe Down. The engineering was punishing. Crews dug through rock that shifted and crumbled without warning, using little more than hand tools, black powder, and raw manpower, cutting a bore nearly a mile long with no natural break in the stone to rest on. It was the kind of project that ate money the way the mountain ate daylight, and the Somerset and Dorset did not have money to spare. The Bath extension, the line built specifically to save the railway, ended up doing the opposite. The cost of driving that mile through Combe Down helped push the company toward the very insolvency it was trying to escape. The tunnel that was meant to be the railway's salvation became, instead, one of the reasons it nearly collapsed before it even opened. The ground itself fought back at every stage. Combe Down sits on oolite, a soft, porous limestone that can look solid right up until it doesn't. Sections of the bore had to be lined and relined as the rock settled and shifted around the workings, adding cost and time to a project that had neither to spare. Men worked by candlelight and lamplight a mile from either entrance, in air that barely moved, years before a single train ever tested what that same lack of airflow would eventually do to a locomotive crew. On the 20th of July, 1874, the extension finally opened anyway, debt and all. Trains began running the mile beneath Combe Down for the first time. Nobody celebrating that day knew they had just opened the longest unventilated railway tunnel in Britain, or that the flaw baked into its design would eventually cost lives. Built with a flaw no one fixed. Here is the detail that makes this tunnel different from almost every other Victorian bore in the country. At 1,829 yards, just over a mile, Combe Down Tunnel had no intermediate ventilation shafts at all. Most long tunnels of the era were built with vertical shafts driven down from the surface at intervals, letting smoke and steam vent upward and fresh air circulate through. Combe Down had none. Whatever a locomotive produced inside that tunnel stayed inside that tunnel until the train reached open air at one end or the other. For decades, this was simply an inconvenience. Crews learned to live with the smoke, the heat, and the stale, humid air of the bore, especially during a slow, heavy haul. It was uncomfortable. It was tolerated. Nobody had proven yet that it could be fatal. Other tunnels of similar length on other lines had shafts sunk straight down from the fields and hillsides above them, giving smoke somewhere to go besides the lungs of the men driving the train. Combe Down never got that treatment. Maybe it was the cost, maybe it was the ground, already difficult enough without adding vertical shafts through unstable limestone. Whatever the reason, the railway made a choice in the 1870s that it would still be living with, unchanged, more than 50 years later. The night the tunnel took the air. That proof came on the 20th of November, 1929. A northbound goods train, heavily loaded and running tender first, entered the tunnel from the Midford end, climbing at a punishing grade with barely any airflow to help it along. The engine was moving slowly, straining under the weight, deep inside a mile of rock with no exit in sight and no ventilation to clear the air behind it. Smoke and fumes built up around the footplate. The driver and firemen, working blind in the dark and the heat, were slowly overcome. By the time the train crested the summit inside the tunnel and began its faster run down toward Bath, there was no one left conscious to control it. The locomotive ran away downhill, gathering speed with no hand on the brake, and crashed into the goods yard on the approach to Bath Green Park Station. The driver, Henry Jennings, was killed, so were two men working in the yard it struck. The official investigation was blunt about the cause: the restricted bore, the total absence of ventilation shafts, the exceptional humidity trapped underground, and the crawling pace of a heavily loaded train running backward through it all had combined to poison the crew before the train ever reached daylight. Combe Down Tunnel had killed 3 men, and it had done it exactly the way its design made almost inevitable. The recommendation afterward was to lighten loads or add assistant engines on the grade. Nobody rebuilt the tunnel. Nobody could. The flaw was permanent, carved into a mile of rock, and the railway simply learned to work around a hazard it was never going to fix. Think about that for a moment. The fix that engineers settled on wasn't to change the tunnel. It was to change how hard trains were allowed to work inside it. The mountain of stone above the bore was not going anywhere, and neither was the design flaw running through the middle of it. Every train that passed through Combe Down after 1929 did so inside the same unventilated mile that had just killed 3 people, simply asked to try a little less hard while it did. A slow death, then no death at all. The Somerset and Dorset limped on for decades after that, a chronically underfunded line that never quite justified the cost of keeping it alive. Post-war Britain had less and less patience for railways like it, and when the nationwide cuts of the 1960s came for the network, the Bath extension was an easy target. The line through Combe Down Tunnel closed for good in March 1966. The following year, demolition trains moved through, stripping out the track and the fittings, leaving the bore as nothing but an empty, echoing shell beneath the hill. What do you do with a mile-long hole through solid rock that no longer serves any purpose? For most of Britain's abandoned Victorian infrastructure, the answer has usually been one of 2 things: quietly demolish it or quietly forget it. Combe Down Tunnel got the second option. The assets of the old line were eventually sold off, and the tunnel itself passed into the hands of Wessex Water, a company with no interest in trains and every reason to simply seal the openings and walk away. And that is exactly what happened. Both ends were closed off. The tunnel that had once carried freight, passengers, and 3 men to their deaths sat entirely alone in the dark, unlit, unused, and slowly forgotten by the town living directly above it. For nearly 40 years, that was the whole story. No trains, no passengers, no cyclists, no light, just a mile of stone under Combe Down, sealed at both ends, doing nothing at all. Above it, Bath carried on exactly as it always had. Buses ran, houses were built, children grew up on streets directly over a mile of pitch-black tunnel that had once claimed 3 lives, most of them with no idea it was even there. A sealed tunnel does not stay frozen just because nobody is using it. Left alone for decades, water finds its way in through the same limestone that gave the builders so much trouble in the first place, seeping through joints and settling in pools along a floor no drainage crew was maintaining anymore. Whatever timber and metalwork survived, the demolition trains was left to rust and rot in the dark, unseen and unrecorded. Locally, the tunnel drifted into the kind of half-remembered status abandoned infrastructure always seems to acquire, a landmark nobody could get inside, known mostly through old maps, the odd photograph, and the occasional dare among teenagers who'd heard there was a barricaded hole in the hillside worth finding. Nobody was maintaining it, nobody was studying it, and for most of those 40 years, nobody outside a small circle of local historians was even thinking about it at all. The campaign nobody expected to win. Reviving a sealed Victorian railway tunnel is not the kind of thing that happens by accident, and for decades, nobody with the power to do it had any real reason to try. That changed with a grassroots campaign that began locally in 2005, driven by residents and cycling advocates who looked at the abandoned Somerset and Dorset trackbed running through Bath and saw something the previous 40 years had missed: a ready-made route, already cut through the landscape, already engineered to grade, sitting completely unused. The idea gained momentum. What started as local pressure became a formal partnership between the sustainable transport charity Sustrans, the local council, and the campaign group itself, all working toward converting the old railway, tunnels included, into a shared use path for walking and cycling. It was not a fast process. Physical construction work on the wider route began in 2010, starting at the smaller of the line's 2 tunnels, the nearby Devonshire Tunnel, before turning to the much larger challenge waiting at Combe Down. Combe Down was always going to be the harder problem. Devonshire Tunnel runs less than 500 yards. Combe Down runs more than 3 times that distance, sealed, unlit, and untouched for decades. Its condition after 40 years underground far from guaranteed. Every yard of it had to be inspected, cleared, and made safe again before a single cyclist could be allowed anywhere near it. It took years of campaigning just to get to the point where construction could start, and years more of construction to turn a dead tunnel back into a usable one. Consider how differently fate treated Combe Down's own sibling tunnel just up the line. Devonshire Tunnel, less than a mile away on the same stretch of the old Somerset and Dorset route, had none of Combe Down's dark history. No ventilation disaster, no fatalities, nothing but a short, unremarkable bore that closed quietly in 1966 along with everything else. It sat sealed for the same 40 years, forgotten in the same way, but its resurrection came easier. Shorter, simpler, and structurally uneventful, it was the tunnel campaigners tackled first, the practice run before anyone was ready to take on the mile of rock next door. Combe Down, the tunnel with the body count, the tunnel that very nearly bankrupted the company that built it, ended up being the harder problem and the bigger prize. It took longer to convert and demanded far more work to make safe, but it was also the piece of the old railway everyone actually wanted, the one worth the wait. 2 tunnels, 1 abandoned line, and only one of them carried a story dark enough to make its eventual reopening feel like it mattered. Reopened, lit, and full of people. The 2 tunnels Greenway opened to the public on the 6th of April 2013, and Combe Down Tunnel became its centerpiece. A mile of darkness that had once been so dangerous it killed 3 men in a single night was resurfaced, fitted with lighting, and opened as the longest cycling tunnel in the whole of Britain. Where a heavily loaded goods engine once struggled for air, cyclists and walkers now pass through freely in a bore that finally has the ventilation and lighting its original builders never gave it. Part of the route even carries an art installation inside the tunnel itself, turning the old hazard into an attraction people specifically travel to experience. Think about what that reversal actually means. The exact conditions that made this tunnel lethal in 1929. The total darkness, the trapped, stagnant air, the mile of rock with no way out except the 2 distant ends, are the same conditions that once made this one of the most feared stretches of railway in the west of England. Modern engineering did not remove the tunnel's darkness. It simply solved the 2 problems the Victorians never did: air and light. Everything else about the space, its length, its isolation, its total enclosure underground, is exactly as it always was. The tunnel didn't get less intense. It got safe enough to enjoy. The loop closes. If you cycle the 2 tunnels Greenway today, south from Bath toward Midford, there is a point where the trail dips underground, and the daylight simply disappears behind you. For the length of that mile, you are inside the exact same rock that swallowed Henry Jennings and 2 other men in 1929. The exact same unbroken darkness that had no shaft, no vent, and no mercy for a slow-moving train and its exhausted crew. The only difference between then and now is that someone finally turned the lights on. A tunnel does not get safer on its own. The danger doesn't leave the rock, it just gets solved, one flaw at a time, sometimes a century after the flaw first killed someone. Combe Down Tunnel was born from a railway's desperate gamble, nearly bankrupted the company that built it, killed 3 men in a single catastrophic night, and then sat completely sealed and forgotten for almost 40 years before anyone thought to give it a second life. It has now spent longer as a cycle path than it ever spent as an operating railway. If you have ever ridden through the Combe Down Tunnel and felt that mile of total blackness close and around you, or if you remember the old Somerset and Dorset line before it closed, or if this is the first you're hearing that a bike path in Bath used to be a place where men died from their own trained smoke, tell me in the comments what you know. The people who remember the old line before the lights went in are the last ones who can tell the rest of us what that darkness actually used to mean.